The prairie. A land that seems endless. A horizon that stretches in every direction, without walls, without boundaries, only sky above and earth below. For many, the first sight of this vast, open plain brought not excitement, but silence. A silence so deep, it almost pressed against the heart. In the mid-19th century, as the United States pushed ever westward, countless families stood at the edge of this open sea of grass. Behind them, the crowded towns of the East. Ahead, the promise of land, free land, vast in size and open to anyone willing to endure its challenges. The story of the homesteaders on the American prairie is not a tale of sudden conquest or grand victories. It is instead a slow and steady story. A story of patient endurance. A story of ordinary people who found themselves far from the comforts they once knew, and who chose, despite every difficulty, to make a home where few imagined one could exist. Tonight we will walk calmly into their world. This is not a tale of battles or of kings. It is not a story filled with drama and noise. Instead, it is a quiet journey into the daily lives of settlers who worked the soil, built their homes and raised their families under a sky so wide it could humble the strongest spirit. We begin not with triumph but with stillness. Imagine, if you will, a family standing at the edge of their new claim. Around them, the tall grasses move with the wind like waves upon a restless ocean. The sun lowers across the horizon, setting the entire land in a warm glow of orange and gold. There are no fences, no roads, no neighbors in sight. Only the distant calls of prairie birds, the rustle of unseen animals, and the faint creak of a wagon resting after its long journey. For many of these families, the journey to this moment had been exhausting. Weeks, sometimes months, of travel by wagon. Days of endless walking beside animals, pulling carts heavy with the essentials of life. And yet, as they paused to look upon this land, there was also hope. For here they would begin again. Life on the prairie was never gentle for the homesteaders. The dream of land and independence was real, but so too were the trials that tested every family. Hardship was not an exception, it was a constant companion. Each day carried the possibility of struggle, whether from the land, the weather, isolation, or simple misfortune. To live as a homesteader was to wake each morning knowing that survival itself was an achievement. The first and most relentless challenge was the weather. The prairie, wide and open, gave no shelter from its extremes. Summers could burn the land under a sun that seemed never to relent. Heat shimmered above the soil, drying crops until leaves curled and stalks withered. Dust clung to faces and clothing, and thirst became a constant worry. When rains did come, they often arrived as violent storms, lightning flashing, winds tearing across the plains and hail hammering the fields. In winter, the land transformed into a frozen wilderness. Winds howled with such force that snow drifted high against houses, sometimes burying doorways and windows. Temperatures plunged and families huddled close to fires, every log of wood precious, every ember guarded carefully. To survive both extremes required foresight and resilience. Crops, upon which families depended, were always vulnerable. Drought could kill them before they even sprouted. Floods could sweep them away in hours. Insects posed another devastating threat. The memory of locust swarms lives deeply in frontier history, clouds of insects so thick they blotted out the sun, descending upon fields and leaving behind nothing but bare stalks. Wheat, corn, gardens, all vanished in the span of days. For families who had no surplus, this meant hunger. For some, it meant ruin. Food shortages haunted many households. Even with good harvests, supplies had to last through long winters. Flour, sugar, and coffee, when available, were rationed with care. Meat came from animals they raised or from wild game, but hunting was not always fruitful. In lean years, meals became simple and sparse: cornmeal mush, boiled potatoes, or bread made from coarse flour. Children sometimes went to bed with empty stomachs, and parents carried the quiet worry of not knowing if there would be enough for tomorrow. Illness was another ever-present hardship. With few doctors on the prairie and medicine often scarce, even minor sickness could become deadly. A fever, a cough, an infected wound, all could endanger lives. Women gave birth without hospitals, often assisted only by neighbors or midwives. Children, exposed to the elements and weakened by hunger, were vulnerable to disease. In winter, sickness spread quickly in the close quarters of sod houses. Families prayed for health, knowing that if serious illness struck, help might be miles, or days, away. Isolation weighed heavily on the mind and spirit. Homesteads were often miles apart, separated by seas of grass. For weeks, sometimes months, families saw no neighbors. Women, left alone with children while men worked in fields, often spoke of loneliness so deep it became its own burden. Letters from relatives back east arrived slowly, if at all, and the vast distance from familiar places pressed heavily upon the heart. The prairie could feel like a world of silence, broken only by wind and the occasional cry of animals. Natural dangers added to the strain. Prairie fires, swift and fierce, could sweep across miles and hours, consuming everything in their path. Families scrambled to plow firebreaks or to soak blankets in water, beating back flames to save their homes. Wildlife, though often more nuisance than threat, also tested their endurance. Coyotes stalked livestock, snakes slipped into houses, and insects filled the air in endless waves. Each encounter reminded settlers that they lived on land not yet tamed, where nature held the greater power. Financial hardship was constant as well. Though land was given through the Homestead Act, tools, seeds, animals, and supplies all cost money. Many families went into debt to begin their new lives, borrowing from merchants or selling possessions. If crops failed, repayment became impossible. Some lost their claims, forced to abandon the prairie and return eastward with little to show for their effort. The dream of ownership could turn, swiftly and painfully, into the reality of loss. Children too bore the weight of hardship. From an early age they worked alongside their parents, not as helpers but as essential laborers. They carried water, herded animals, weeded fields, and tended fires. Their childhoods were short, their play limited, and their responsibilities heavy. Education was rare in the earliest years, with schoolhouses scattered miles apart. Parents taught what they could at home, but often, the needs of survival outweighed the lessons of books. Despite all these trials, families endured through resilience and faith. Hardship, though crushing, also bound them together. Neighbors, though far apart, helped one another when disaster struck. A family whose barn burned might find neighbors arriving unasked, bringing wood, nails, and hands to rebuild. Women gathered for births or illnesses, offering comfort and skill. Children, when they met at community gatherings or churches, laughed and played with a joy that reminded adults why they struggled. The hardships of the prairie stripped life to its essentials. They taught settlers that comfort was rare, but survival was possible. They learned to value small victories, the first loaf of bread from newly milled wheat, the sight of healthy calves in spring, the gathering of neighbors for a shared meal. Hardship made them cautious, but it also made them grateful. For some, the trials became too great. Families packed their wagons once more, leaving behind half-built homes, unplowed fields, and unfulfilled dreams. Their absence was felt by those who remained, reminders of how fragile the dream could be. But for those who endured, each hardship overcome was a quiet triumph, proof that they could withstand what the land demanded. The prairie was never promised to be easy. It was vast, untamed, and indifferent to human effort. Yet, the homesteaders who stayed did so because they believed that beyond the trials lay reward. They endured the burning sun, the bitter cold, the locusts, the loneliness, and the hunger because they hoped that someday, their children would live with greater ease. Their sacrifices became the foundation of communities that would one day thrive where once there was only open grass. And so, the story of the homesteader is not one of comfort but of survival. It is a story of hardship faced with quiet determination, of trials endured not with glory but with patience. Each challenge tested them, and each one they survived made them stronger. In the end, their resilience was as much a part of the prairie as the wind, the grass, and the sky. In telling their story we will move slowly, the way their days moved. Long mornings of labor. Quiet evenings around a small fire. The rhythm of nature itself dictating every task. We will see the hardships they faced, the hunger, the loneliness, the storms, and the cold. But we will also see the quiet joys, the satisfaction of building with one's own hands, the small comfort of a meal after work, the laughter of children in the grasslands. This introduction serves as an invitation. An invitation to step away from the speed of the modern world, to leave behind the constant noise, and to enter instead a time and place where life moved gently, even when it was difficult. The American frontier is often remembered in bold images, gunfighters, railroads, and sudden fortunes. Yet for most who came west, life was not fast or violent. It was slow, careful, and deliberate. A process of shaping the land and of being shaped by it in return. As we begin this journey, imagine yourself not as an observer but as one of them. A settler. A homesteader. Someone who, with quiet determination, steps onto the prairie and breathes in the wide open air. The prairie may seem empty at first glance. But listen carefully and it is never silent. There is always the sigh of the wind, carrying with it the scents of earth and wildflowers. There are the distant songs of meadowlarks, bright and clear against the horizon. There is the rustling of grasses, tall and alive, bending in unison to the invisible hand of the weather. To the homesteaders, these sounds were both comfort and reminder. Comfort because they marked the pulse of the natural world. Reminder because they spoke of a land that would not yield easily. To live here would mean to listen, to learn its patterns, to respect its power, and to endure its extremes. And so, as this story unfolds, we will move slowly across time. We will begin with the call of the prairie, with the reasons people came. We will walk with them across the journey westward. We will step with them into the raw challenge of building homes, and into the simple rhythm of their daily lives. We will witness the changing of the seasons, the hardships endured, and the quiet triumphs won. Above all, we will remember that theirs was not a life of sudden glory. It was a life of patience. A life measured not in moments of excitement, but in years of steady labor and resilience. This is the calm history of the homesteaders. A story not meant to thrill but to soothe. A story not filled with noise, but with quiet echoes of the past. A story that invites us to listen, to reflect, and perhaps, to close our eyes as the voices of history settle gently into rest. The story of the prairie begins not with the open grasslands themselves, but with the restless hearts of people far away, living in crowded towns, weary farms, and bustling ports of the eastern United States. For them, the prairie was a whisper, a promise carried by word of mouth, by government proclamations, and by stories of friends who had gone before. It was a promise that somewhere beyond the horizon, there stretched land that was free, fertile, and waiting to be claimed. In the 1860s, this promise became more than rumor. The Homestead Act, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862, told families that if they were willing to leave the known comforts of the East and travel westward, they could stake a claim to 160 acres of land. To many this seemed an unimaginable gift. Land was power, security, and future. To own land meant no longer being tied to landlords, factories, or the uncertain wages of city life. It meant independence, the chance to build something lasting with one's own hands. But the call of the prairie was not heard in one voice. For some, it was the call of poverty, families in crowded tenements who dreamed of escape. For others, it was the call of ambition, young men and women who longed to carve out a place for themselves, away from the shadow of their parents' lives. Immigrants from Europe heard it too, stepping off ships in crowded harbors and learning that in America, there was still land to be had. German, Swedish, Irish, and countless others would take their chance, packing wagons and moving toward the unknown. The prairie's call was both simple and deceptive. Simple because it promised land. Deceptive because that land was not easy to claim. To make it truly theirs, homesteaders had to live upon it for 5 years, to farm it and to build upon it. The government's gift was not free, it was bound by sweat, by effort, and by survival. Yet to those who listened to the call, the hardships ahead seemed worth the price. Imagine, for a moment, a family seated by the hearth of a small cabin in Ohio or Pennsylvania. The father speaks softly about a notice posted in town: land in Nebraska, land in Kansas, free to any man who will settle it. The mother hesitates, thinking of children, of sickness, of danger. Yet the father's eyes are steady, and he speaks of the future, of sons who will inherit their own fields, of daughters who will marry without fear of hunger. Slowly the dream takes hold, glowing like embers in the minds of the family. And so wagons are loaded. Possessions are sold or left behind. Only the essentials are carried: tools, seeds, blankets, a few cherished keepsakes. The rest is abandoned to the past. In the call of the prairie there is always sacrifice. To gain the new, one must leave the old. For many, the idea of open land was more than economic, it was spiritual. Writers of the time spoke of the West as a place where man could return to simplicity, where the noise of cities gave way to the voice of the wind, and where God's creation stretched out untouched. Some saw it as destiny, a fulfillment of the belief that America was meant to expand from ocean to ocean. Others saw it simply as hope, a chance to live with dignity and independence. Yet, the prairie itself did not call with kindness. The land was vast but also unforgiving. There were no roads, no fences, no easy shelters. For those who came, it would be a trial of endurance. Still, the idea of land, free and fertile, sang louder than warnings. The dream outweighed the doubt. And so, families began to move. Some traveled alone, others in wagon trains. From Missouri, from Iowa, from Illinois, lines of settlers stretched westward. Slowly, steadily, like a tide of humanity creeping over the plains. The call of the prairie had become movement, a great migration carried not by armies, but by farmers, mothers, and children. The call of the prairie was not one of adventure, though it is often remembered that way. It was quieter, steadier, like the low hum of a song sung at dusk. It spoke to the weary, to the hopeful, and to those who longed for rest from crowded lives. Its promise was not riches overnight, but acres of soil, fields of wheat, and a home of one's own. This section of the story reminds us that every journey begins with longing. The prairie did not simply appear to these families, it was imagined long before they saw it, drawn in their minds by words of promise and by the steady pull of hope. As we leave this part of the tale, we move with them, step by step, from the quiet towns of the east to the open unknown of the west. The call has been heard. The wagons are ready. The prairie waits. The call of the prairie, once heard, could not be ignored. Families who had decided to leave the familiar behind now faced the long road west. It was not a short trip, nor was it an easy one. To reach the prairie meant weeks, sometimes months, of travel across distances that seemed endless, where the land itself was both guide and obstacle. The journey often began at the edge of the frontier towns, places like Independence, Missouri, or Council Bluffs, Iowa, where travelers gathered to prepare their wagons. These towns were busy crossroads, filled with the creak of wagon wheels, the braying of oxen, and the voices of settlers purchasing supplies. For many, it was the last taste of crowded streets before entering a world of silence and space. The wagons themselves were not the grand carriages of imagination. They were simple wooden carts, covered with canvas and pulled by oxen or mules. Inside, every inch was packed with what a family thought essential: tools for farming, seeds for planting, food for the first weeks, blankets, clothing, and perhaps a Bible or a family heirloom. There was little room for comfort. Children often walked beside the wagons, their small hands brushing the tall grasses, while mothers tended fires at night and fathers steered the slow-moving teams by day. The pace of the journey was steady, almost hypnotic. Oxen plodded forward with patience, their hooves pressing into soil and stone. Wheels groaned, ropes creaked, and the canvas tops rippled in the prairie wind. The sounds of travel became a rhythm, soft, repetitive, soothing in their constancy. 4 days on end, the horizon seemed unchanged, an endless sky above, an endless plain below. Time itself seemed to stretch and blur. At night, the prairie revealed its other face. The families would stop, forming small camps where fires flickered in the open dark. Overhead, the stars burned in vast numbers, brighter than any sky seen back east. Some settlers found comfort in the stars, imagining them as companions on the lonely road. Others felt humbled by their silence, realizing how small human lives were in comparison to the vastness of creation. The prairie was not empty, though it seemed so to those first arrivals. Herds of bison roamed in the distance, their movements like shadows against the horizon. Prairie dogs chirped and scattered near their burrows, while coyotes howled faintly at night. Birds circled above the grasses, their cries carried far by the wind. To the untrained eye, the land looked barren, but to those who watched closely, it was alive with quiet motion. The journey was not without hardship. The weather could change in a moment. One day hot and breathless, the next filled with sudden rainstorms that turned paths into rivers of mud. Winds swept across the plains with such force they rattled wagons and chilled weary travelers. Dust clung to faces, to clothing, to every surface. Yet, through it all, families pressed forward, driven by the memory of the promise that land awaited them. For children, the road was both adventure and monotony. Some days were filled with games, racing ahead of the wagons or gathering wildflowers along the way. Other days were endless, with little to see but grass and sky. They asked questions: how far now? When will we be there? Questions that parents answered with patient smiles, though they too often wondered how long the road might be. Meals were simple. A small fire, a pot of stew or bread baked in coals, shared in silence after long hours of travel. Water was precious, and streams were greeted with relief, both for people and for animals. Sleep came quickly, bodies worn from walking, minds dulled by the slow rhythm of the day. There were dangers as well. Wagons could break, wheels splintering under the strain of heavy loads. Oxen could grow ill or collapse, leaving families stranded until help arrived. Rivers had to be crossed, some shallow and gentle, others treacherous with swift currents. The land itself seemed to test every traveler as though asking, "Are you strong enough to stay?" Yet even in hardship there were moments of quiet beauty. Dawn on the prairie was a soft unfolding of light, painting the grasses with gold. Sunset stretched endlessly across the horizon, lingering long after the sun itself had vanished. The air was filled with the scent of earth and the sound of wind, reminders that the land, though harsh, also carried its own peace. For the settlers, each mile traveled was both a step away from the familiar and a step closer to a dream. They knew that what lay ahead was uncertain, but the thought of owning land, of building a future with their own hands, carried them forward. Hope was their compass, guiding them when the horizon seemed to offer no end. The journey westward was more than a movement of bodies. It was a movement of spirit. Families learned patience, endurance, and trust, not only in themselves but in one another. Every day tested their resolve, and every night gave them reason to cling to their faith that the land ahead would be worth the sacrifice. And so, wagon by wagon, step by step, they pressed into the unknown. The prairie stretched before them, vast and untamed, waiting to see who would endure and who would turn back. The journey was not quick, but it was steady, like the ticking of a clock whose hands moved only forward. As we follow them into the heart of the prairie, we carry with us the sound of creaking wheels, the steady rhythm of oxen's hooves, and the quiet determination of those who walked beside them. The road ahead is long, the challenges many, but the promise of land glows faintly on the horizon, a beacon guiding them through the silence of the plains. The journey has begun, and with it, the slow transformation of both the land and the people who dared to cross it. When the long journey westward finally ended, the moment was both quiet and profound. A wagon would stop, the oxen released from their harnesses, and a family would step down into the tall grass of their chosen claim. This was the land they had dreamed about, the acres promised by law and longed for in memory. It was not yet a home, it was raw, untouched, and vast. But for the homesteader, it was the canvas upon which they would carve a new life. The very first task was shelter. On the open prairie, there were few trees to cut for lumber, and stone was often scarce. What settlers had in abundance was earth itself. Thick prairie sod, woven together by roots, could be cut into blocks and used as bricks. And so, the sod house, known simply as a soddy, became the most common dwelling of the homesteaders. Building a soddy was slow, patient work. Men would take heavy plows or spades and slice the prairie grass into long strips. Each strip was then cut into blocks, often about 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 6 inches thick. These blocks, surprisingly strong due to the interlocking roots, were stacked one upon another like masonry. Layer by layer, the walls rose, earthy and rough, until the outline of a home appeared. The process was far from glamorous. Dirt crumbled with each cut, and sod was heavy to lift. But with persistence, families raised walls that were thick enough to keep out the worst of the prairie winds. A roof might be made of more sod, supported by wooden beams if available, or by whatever scraps of timber could be found or traded for. Windows were rare at first, perhaps a single pane of glass carried all the way from the east, or simply a shuttered opening. A doorway was framed with rough boards, sometimes with a curtain or blanket until a proper door could be fashioned. Inside, the house was humble. The earthen walls were dark, and in damp weather they smelled of soil. During rains, water sometimes trickled through, and in the heat of summer, insects could wriggle in. Yet, despite these challenges, sod houses offered safety. They were cool in summer, warm in winter, and sturdy enough to resist the sweeping prairie winds that could topple tents or wooden shacks. For the family that had spent weeks beneath a wagon canvas, even this crude shelter was a place of relief. Once shelter was secured, the next task was water. Wells were dug, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep, depending on the land. A family might spend days lowering buckets and pulling up soil until, at last, the earth yielded water. This was a moment of celebration, for water meant survival, not only for the family but for their animals and their future crops. Fields, too, had to be prepared. The land, untouched by plow, was tough and stubborn. Prairie grasses had roots that reached deep, binding the soil in thick mats. Breaking this land was back-breaking work. A steel plow, sharp and heavy, was often needed to cut through the sod. Men walked behind the plow, guiding it forward while animals strained against the harness. The first furrows were hard-won, but once the soil was turned, it revealed a rich earth that promised crops of wheat, corn, or barley. Around the home, small gardens were planted with vegetables, beans, squash, onions, food that could grow quickly and sustain a family until harvest of grain arrived. Seeds had been carried carefully on the journey, wrapped and stored like treasures. Each seed pressed into the soil was a small act of hope, a promise that tomorrow might be easier than today. Life in those first weeks was a cycle of work. Morning began with the tending of animals, oxen, perhaps a cow for milk or a few chickens for eggs. Then came the labor of building, of breaking land, of repairing what was broken by wind or weather. Women tended fires, prepared meals from limited supplies, and cared for children who roamed the grasses in curious wonder. In the evenings, after the sun had set and the work had finally ended, families sat in the quiet hum of the prairie night. Crickets sang, the wind sighed through the grass, and above them, Stars filled the sky with uncountable light. Despite the hardships, there was a sense of pride in these first homes. Each wall of sod, each acre of soil turned marked progress. The land, which had seemed endless and indifferent, was beginning to take shape beneath human hands. Slowly a claim became a homestead. Not all families built only with sod. In areas where trees could be found, near rivers or wooded patches, log cabins were raised. Where stone was available, walls of rock were stacked. Yet, regardless of material, the task was the same: to create a shelter strong enough to endure storms and winters, and a place warm enough to hold the laughter and tears of daily life. Community too played a role. Neighbors, though often miles apart, came together for house raisings, or barn raisings. With many hands, a structure could be built more quickly, and such gatherings were as much social as they were practical. In these moments, the lonely prairie felt less vast, and the bonds of friendship grew from shared effort. Children, too, found roles in the building of a home. Boys carried water or gathered sod pieces. Girls helped prepare food or kept watch over younger siblings. Even small tasks mattered, for survival was a family affair. To live on the prairie meant that every hand, no matter how small, had value. The sod house was rarely perfect. In summer, the thick walls grew hot and flies swarmed indoors. In winter, frost crept across the earthen walls, and snow sometimes drifted through the roof. Yet, despite its flaws, it was a shelter against the vastness of the prairie. It was proof that a family had arrived, had chosen a place, and had begun to build their future. To build a home on the prairie was to make a promise, to the land, to the family, and to generations yet to come. It was not an easy promise. The house was rough, the work was endless, and the challenges were unrelenting. But the home was more than shelter. It was a symbol. A place where a weary family could rest after days of toil, where meals could be shared, and where children could sleep in safety. Step by step, wall by wall, the prairie was being tamed, not by force or speed but by patient, steady effort. Each soddy, each cabin, each plowed field was a mark of determination, an act of faith that the land would provide if only one worked hard enough to claim it. And so the prairie began to change. What had once been a sea of grass now held small islands of human life. Sod houses crouched against the wind, smoke curling from chimneys, and fields stretching outward in straight, plowed lines. The land was no longer empty. It was becoming home. The prairie offered land, but it did not offer ease. Once a home had been raised and the first fields broken, life settled into a rhythm that was both demanding and strangely soothing. Daily existence for the homesteaders was marked not by leisure but by constant labor. Yet, within this labor there was a quiet order, a steady beat that carried families through days, weeks, and seasons. To understand the life of a homesteader is to step into a world where survival depended on routine, and where every task, however small, had purpose. Morning began early, often before the sun had risen above the horizon. The prairie at dawn was still and cool, its grasses damp with dew. Birds stirred, calling to one another in the first light, while the homesteader's family rose from simple beds, perhaps straw mattresses, perhaps blankets spread upon the earthen floor. The first duty of the day was fire. Someone, often the mother or eldest child, rekindled the embers from the night before, coaxing smoke into flame. From this fire came heat for the house and warmth for breakfast. Meals were plain but sustaining. Cornmeal porridge, bread baked in iron pans, or salt pork fried in a skillet. Coffee, when available, was a treasured comfort, its aroma filling the sod house and offering a small reminder of the world left behind. Children ate quickly, for work awaited them as much as it did their parents. The men and older boys turned first to the fields. If it was spring, the plow would be taken out, its iron blade cutting into the stubborn sod. Behind the plow, the earth turned dark and fresh, releasing a smell both earthy and sharp. In summer, the fields required tending, weeds pulled, and rows kept clear. In autumn, the harvest consumed every hour, sheaves of wheat bundled, corn gathered, and vegetables carried in from gardens. Even in winter, the men labored, mending tools, repairing fences, or cutting firewood when it could be found. For women, work was no lighter. The prairie home required constant tending. Meals had to be cooked 3 times a day, often from scratch, using ingredients grown or preserved months before. Bread was kneaded and baked, milk churned into butter, and vegetables stored in cellars. Water had to be carried in from wells or streams, sometimes bucket by bucket, heavy and unyielding. Clothing, too, was a daily concern. Women spun wool, patched torn garments, and sewed by hand, their needles flashing in the dim light of the soddy. Laundry, in particular, was a task of endurance. Clothes were scrubbed against boards, boiled in kettles over outdoor fires, and then wrung by hand before being hung to dry in the prairie wind. Each piece, heavy with water, demanded strength. Yet these chores, repetitive and exhausting, formed the rhythm of life. They were never-ending, but they gave shape to the days. Children were not idle. From a young age, boys and girls learned that their help was needed for the family to survive. Boys drove teams of oxen, gathered kindling, or helped in the fields. Girls fetched water, cared for younger siblings, or helped their mothers with cooking and sewing. Even small children carried out tasks, gathering eggs, chasing stray chickens, or picking wild berries when the season allowed. Play existed, of course, but it was brief and often tied to the landscape around them. Games invented among the grasses or quiet moments under the vast prairie sky. The homesteader's day was marked by sound. The steady thud of the axe against wood. The creak of wagon wheels carrying loads from field to home. The call of animals, cows lowing, chickens clucking, horses stamping their hooves. The wind was always present, whispering through the grass, rattling against the sod walls, carrying with it the sense that the prairie itself was alive and listening. Food was both a joy and a challenge. While the soil was fertile, the first years often yielded little. Families relied on preserved goods, dried beans, flour, salt pork, and what little they could hunt or gather. A rabbit snared in the brush, a deer shot at the edge of the plains, or berries picked in summer could make the difference between hunger and satisfaction. Women became skilled at stretching meals, creating soups or stews that filled bellies even when ingredients were scarce. In autumn, they preserved what they could, drying apples, smoking meat, and storing root vegetables for the long winter ahead. Evenings brought a brief sense of rest. After hours of work, the family gathered around the fire or table. Supper was eaten in quiet, with talk of the day's work or plans for the next. Children drowsed in the warmth, their eyes heavy after long hours of chores. Sometimes there was music, a fiddle brought from the east or a harmonica carried in a pocket. Hymns were sung softly, prayers spoken in gratitude for another day endured. Then came sleep, deep and unbroken as the wind sighed over the endless prairie. Though monotonous, daily life was not without small joys. The birth of a calf, the first green shoots in spring, the taste of fresh bread from a new harvest, all brought satisfaction. Families took pride in what they had built, even when it was meager. A sod house, though humble, was still theirs. A field, though small, was still worked by their hands. Sundays were different. For many it was a day of rest and reflection. Work in the fields paused, and families dressed in their best clothing, perhaps only slightly better than their everyday wear. If a church was nearby, they traveled to it, sometimes walking miles or riding in wagons. If not, prayers were spoken at home, readings made from a family Bible. These moments, rare and precious, reminded homesteaders of community and faith, even in isolation. The monotony of daily labor might seem harsh to modern eyes, yet to the homesteaders, it became a source of rhythm and meaning. Work filled every hour, but it also gave structure to their lives. Each task, though repetitive, carried them forward. Each day's labor brought them closer to the harvest, closer to security, closer to the dream that had carried them westward. Life on the prairie was not one of ease, but it was a life lived with purpose. Every action, from the cutting of sod to the mending of clothes, was part of a larger story. A story of survival, of determination, and of quiet perseverance. The homesteaders did not seek glory, they sought continuity. They sought the simple satisfaction of ending each day knowing they had endured. And so their daily lives passed in cycles. Morning to evening, spring to winter, seed to harvest. The work never ceased, but neither did the hope. In the repetition of chores, in the rhythm of the prairie, there was a strange kind of peace. A peace born not of idleness, but of knowing that even in hardship, they were building something lasting. This was the life of the homesteader, steady, humble, and enduring. A life of daily labor, yes, but also a life of quiet dignity, lived beneath the wide and endless sky. Life on the prairie was ruled not by clocks, nor by calendars, but by the slow turning of the seasons. Each season carried its own character, its own burdens, and its own small gifts. For the homesteaders, survival meant adjusting their lives to the rhythm of nature, accepting what could not be changed, preparing for what could be endured, and savoring the rare moments of beauty the land allowed. The seasons were both friend and foe, and in their endless cycle, they shaped the lives of those who dared to settle the prairie. Spring was a time of renewal but also of labor. After long, dark winters, the thaw brought with it hope and urgency. Snow melted into the soil, filling streams and softening the earth. Grasses began to stir again, shooting up through the damp ground, their fresh green color a signal that life was returning. For homesteaders, spring meant planting. Men harnessed oxen to plows, cutting long furrows through fields still heavy with moisture. Women and children followed, dropping seeds into the turned soil, covering them with care. Each seed was a gamble, whether rain would come, whether storms would destroy, whether pests would arrive. But without planting there could be no harvest, and so spring was a season of faith. Spring also carried its dangers. Rains, though welcome, could be relentless. Heavy storms swelled rivers until they overflowed, flooding fields and washing away weeks of effort. Thunder rolled across the open land, and lightning cracked against the sky, setting fires in dry grasses. Winds tore at roofs, and sudden frosts could destroy tender shoots overnight. Yet, in the quiet moments after storms, when the air smelled of wet earth and the prairie glistened with fresh dew, settlers found reassurance. The cycle had begun again, and with it came the promise of growth. Summer on the prairie was a season of extremes. The sun rose early and lingered late, its heat pressing down upon the land without mercy. Days grew long, stretching into hours of work that seemed never to end. Fields demanded constant attention. Rows weeded, plants watered, animals tended. Men sweated beneath the open sky, their shirts clinging to their backs as they swung scythes or guided plows. Women worked beside them, carrying water, tending gardens, and keeping meals ready for tired hands. Children, too, felt the weight of summer, running errands, chasing animals, or helping to gather early harvests. But summer was not only toil. It was also abundance. Gardens ripened, offering beans, squash, and cucumbers. Berry bushes bent under the weight of their fruit, and wildflowers painted the prairie with color. At night, after long days of work, families sometimes gathered outside their sod houses, the air warm and filled with the chorus of crickets. The prairie sky at night was a tapestry of stars, stretching wider than imagination. Beneath that sky, families shared quiet moments of peace, their weariness softened by the beauty around them. Yet summer could be cruel. Heat baked the soil until it cracked. Rain sometimes failed, leaving crops to wither in the fields. Locust swarms could descend, their wings darkening the sky, their hunger stripping plants bare in hours. Fires, sparked by lightning or by the careless flame of a campfire, raced through the grasses, unstoppable in their fury. For the homesteader, summer was a season of hard-won survival, where the line between plenty and famine was as thin as a single storm cloud. Autumn arrived with relief. The heat softened, and the prairie grasses turned golden, rolling like waves in the wind. For the homesteaders, autumn was the season of gathering. Harvests filled every hand, wheat cut and bound into sheaves, corn pulled from stalks, pumpkins and squash gathered from gardens. Families worked together from dawn until dusk, storing away what they could not eat immediately. Women preserved fruits, dried vegetables, and salted meats. Cellars filled with food, a treasure trove against the winter ahead. Autumn was also a season of community. Neighbors helped one another with harvests, sharing labor in exchange for shared security. Barn raisings, threshing days, and communal meals brought settlers together in rare celebration. Children laughed in fields, tossing husks into piles, while parents paused to breathe in the crisp, cool air. Autumn was a reminder that their labor bore fruit, that the long days of toil could be rewarded. Yet it was also a season of preparation, for every settler knew what came next. Winter on the prairie was a force unlike any other. The open land offered no shield against the cold winds that swept down from the north. Snow fell in heavy drifts, sometimes burying homes up to their roofs. The air grew sharp, stinging against skin, freezing water before it could be drawn from wells. Days grew short, and nights seemed endless, broken only by the crackle of fire inside the sod house. For families, winter was a season of endurance. Fields lay silent, animals huddled in barns or makeshift shelters, and people remained close to the hearth. Food stored during autumn became their lifeline. Each meal was measured, every portion carefully rationed. Firewood, if not gathered in enough supply, became precious, and some families resorted to burning twisted bundles of dried grass when wood could not be found. Illness, too, stalked the winter. Fevers and coughs spread easily in cramped quarters, and without nearby doctors, families often faced sickness alone. Yet, winter also carried its own kind of peace. Snow blanketed the prairie, muffling sound, softening the harshness of the land. Children, bundled in patched coats, played in drifts, their laughter carrying faintly on the cold air. Families gathered close in the evenings, reading from Bibles, telling stories, or listening to the faint whistle of the wind outside. Winter was harsh, yes, but it was also intimate, a time when families leaned on one another more closely than ever. The seasons of the prairie did more than shape the lives of homesteaders. They shaped their spirits. Spring taught them hope, Summer demanded endurance, autumn rewarded labor, and winter required patience. Together, the cycle of seasons created a rhythm that mirrored the rhythm of their lives, challenging, humbling, but also steady and eternal. For those who lived through them, the seasons were not merely background, they were characters in the great story of survival. Each one tested, each one gave, and each one reminded the homesteaders that they were part of a larger cycle. One that continued long before them and one that would continue long after. On the prairie, time was not measured in hours but in seasons. And in those seasons, the homesteaders found both hardship and meaning, enduring the cycle year after year, as their lives became as steady and unyielding as the land itself. Though the prairie was a land of isolation, it was also a place where human connection took on profound meaning. Neighbors were few, but when they existed, they were essential. For the homesteaders, community was not merely a social luxury, it was a necessity for survival. Out on the open plains, where storms could strike suddenly and loneliness could weigh heavily, the bonds between families brought strength, comfort, and a sense that they were not entirely alone in their struggles. The distances between homesteads were vast. Sometimes the nearest neighbor was 2, 3, or even 5 miles away, a distance that on foot or by wagon could feel like an entire journey. Yet those miles were bridged by goodwill. If one family fell ill, others would come, even if it meant walking through snow or crossing muddy streams. If a barn burned or a roof collapsed under heavy snow, neighbors arrived with tools, lumber, and hands ready to work. This culture of mutual aid was not optional, it was understood. Life was too harsh to allow selfishness, and generosity was a kind of unspoken law on the prairie. Barn raisings were among the most notable expressions of community life. When a family needed a new barn, word spread quickly across the prairie. On the appointed day, neighbors gathered, men bringing axes, saws, and hammers, women carrying baskets of food, children trailing behind with curious eyes. Together, they raised beams, nailed boards, and lifted walls into place. By evening, a barn stood where none had been that morning, a symbol not only of work completed but of bonds strengthened. Afterward, families shared a meal, laughter filled the air, and for a moment the loneliness of the prairie seemed to vanish. Churches and schools became the centers of prairie community. At first, gatherings were held in homes or simple sod buildings, with benches made of rough wood and hymnals shared between families. Ministers often traveled long distances, moving from settlement to settlement, carrying the word of faith as a source of comfort. Services were as much about fellowship as they were about worship. Neighbors who had not seen one another for weeks gathered to exchange news, share food, and find reassurance in the simple presence of others. Schools, too, were lifelines of community. A single-room schoolhouse, often built with donated labor and supplies, served as the heart of many settlements. Children walked or rode for miles across the prairie to sit at wooden desks, their lessons written on slate boards. The teacher, sometimes barely older than her students, taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Yet schools were not just for learning, they were places where families gathered for meetings, dances, and holiday celebrations. The sound of children reciting lessons or laughing at play brought life to a land that could otherwise feel silent and empty. Social gatherings, though rare, were treasured. Quilting bees allowed women to come together, stitching fabric into patterns while sharing stories, recipes, and laughter. Harvest festivals celebrated the fruits of hard labor, with tables set outdoors, laden with whatever each family could provide. Music played a central role at these events. A fiddle, a harmonica, or a simple banjo could transform an evening into one of joy. Dances were held in barns or in open fields, the stomping of feet and the rhythm of song echoing against the vast night sky. Even small visits carried great meaning. A neighbor arriving at a doorstep, bringing news or a loaf of bread, was welcomed with warmth. Time was taken for conversation, for the sharing of hardships, and for the reassurance that others faced the same trials. For women especially, these visits were vital. The isolation of prairie homes weighed heavily, and the chance to speak with another woman, even briefly, lifted spirits and lightened burdens. Community also provided safety. Prairie fires, storms, and illness could overwhelm a single family. But together, neighbors formed lines to beat back flames, helped rebuild shattered homes, and cared for children when parents could not. These acts were not grand gestures. They were simple, steady commitments to one another. Each family knew that their own survival might one day depend on the kindness of others. For children, community meant companionship. Life on the homestead could be lonely with only siblings for company. But when neighbors gathered, children ran freely across fields, playing games, chasing one another, and sharing the joy of youth. Friendships formed in these brief but precious moments often lasted into adulthood, binding families together even more tightly. The bonds of community extended beyond labor and survival. They also provided meaning. Holidays, for example, carried special weight. Christmas on the prairie was often simple, perhaps a small tree cut from a distant grove, decorated with paper chains or strings of popcorn. Gifts, if given, were handmade, a doll carved from wood, mittens knitted from wool, or a book carefully saved for. Yet the joy of gathering, of singing hymns by lamplight, gave the season a depth that required no extravagance. In this way, the prairie community became a kind of extended family. Though blood ties might be distant, the ties of shared struggle and shared hope were strong. These bonds created trust, resilience, and a sense of belonging that endured even in the hardest times. Yet community was fragile too. Families sometimes gave up their claims, worn down by hardship, and returned eastward. Their absence left gaps in the fabric of the settlement, holes felt deeply by those who remained. Each loss reminded the others of how tenuous their own lives were on the prairie. Still, those who stayed carried on, rebuilding community through persistence and faith. In the end, prairie life could not have endured without community. Individual strength was vital, but collective support was indispensable. The prairie was too wide, too harsh, and too indifferent to be faced alone. Neighbors, though few, became lifelines, their presence a reminder that even in isolation humanity could find connection. And so, in barns, in churches, in schools, and in simple acts of kindness, the prairie community was built. It was not grand nor was it large. But it was steady, resilient, and deeply cherished. Through it, homesteaders found not only survival but a sense of belonging, a reminder that they were part of something greater than themselves. The prairie was not empty, though at first glance it might have seemed so. To the eyes of the homesteaders, who had left behind forests, towns, and villages, the vast grasslands stretched endlessly, a sea of waving stalks beneath an immense sky. Yet within that seeming emptiness was life, wild, untamed, and often surprising. Nature was both ally and adversary. It gave beauty and sustenance, but it also carried danger and challenge. To settle the prairie was to learn each day, to live alongside its creatures and to respect its quiet, unpredictable power. The first encounters were often with the land itself. The prairie grasses towered tall, some reaching the height of a person. Their roots ran deep, binding the soil in a network so thick it resisted the plow. Walking through them, settlers heard the constant rustle of unseen movement, mice darting, insects buzzing, snakes sliding silently between stalks. The grasses bent in waves beneath the wind, creating a landscape that shifted like an ocean, alive and restless even in silence. Birds filled the skies, their calls carrying across the open expanse. Meadowlarks sang in bright, clear tones that lifted spirits during long days of work. Hawks circled overhead, their sharp cries echoing as they hunted. In the early mornings and evenings, the haunting calls of prairie chickens rose, strange and resonant, reminding settlers that this land had long belonged to creatures other than themselves. To hear these sounds was to be reminded that the prairie was never truly still. Animals moved across the land in ways that astonished newcomers. Deer emerged from distant groves to graze near fields, their silhouettes graceful against the horizon. Rabbits darted through gardens, quick and elusive. Coyotes prowled in the night, their yips and howls drifting through the darkness, sometimes chilling, sometimes simply a reminder of the wildness beyond the walls of the sod house. Wolves, less common but still feared, occasionally appeared at the edges of settlements, their eyes glinting in the firelight before melting back into the grass. For many homesteaders, the most memorable encounters were with bison. Once numbering in the millions, these massive animals still roamed the plains in herds that darkened the land as they moved. A distant rumble might herald their approach, the ground trembling beneath countless hooves. Families paused their work to watch in awe as the herd passed, a living river of strength and power. To some, the bison were symbols of the untamed land they had chosen to inhabit. To others, they were a source of meat, hides, and tools. Yet they were also a reminder that the prairie was not theirs alone. Smaller creatures filled daily life with both nuisance and necessity. Prairie dogs, chirping and alert, created sprawling towns of burrows, their mounds dotting the fields. Children delighted in watching them, though farmers cursed their holes, which could break wagon wheels or injure livestock. Insects were ever present, mosquitoes in clouds during summer evenings, grasshoppers chewing through fields, flies buzzing in relentless numbers. Their presence was unavoidable, and settlers learned to live with their irritation as part of the price of survival. Not all encounters were unwelcome. Wildflowers painted the prairie with bursts of color each spring and summer, purple coneflowers, golden sunflowers, and delicate pasque-flowers swaying gently in the breeze. For weary families, these blossoms were reminders of beauty amid hardship, gifts from the land that required no labor to enjoy. Wild berries, too, were gathered with joy. Children returned with hands stained purple from chokecherries or juneberries, their laughter echoing across the fields as they savored the sweetness. Nature could be generous, but it could also be cruel. Rattlesnakes hid in the grasses, their warning buzz sending shivers through even the bravest settlers. A careless step could mean a bite, and with little medicine available, such an injury was often deadly. Prairie fires, sparked by lightning or human carelessness, were another constant threat. Flames leapt high and spread fast, racing across the dry grasses with terrifying speed. Families fought them with desperation, beating flames with wet blankets or plowing firebreaks in hopes of saving their homes. Storms were perhaps the most dramatic expression of nature's power. The prairie sky, so wide and unobstructed, gave no shelter from approaching clouds. Dark masses rolled in from the distance, lightning splitting the sky in blinding flashes, thunder shaking the ground beneath. Rain came in sheets, pounding against roofs and flooding fields. Hail shattered crops, sometimes shredding entire harvests in minutes. And winds, wild, unbroken winds, howled across the open land, tearing at houses and barns, leaving families to pray as they clung together inside their fragile shelters. Despite the dangers, many settlers spoke with reverence of the prairie's majesty. Sunrises bathed the grasses in gold, while sunsets stretched endlessly, the sky painted with hues of orange, pink, and violet. The air, filled with the scents of earth, grass, and rain, carried a freshness unknown in cities. At night, the stars blazed in such numbers that the heavens seemed alive, vast, and unending. These moments reminded settlers why they had come, offering peace amid the hardships. Living with nature on the prairie required adaptation. Families learned to store food securely against animals, to watch carefully for snakes, to read the sky for signs of storms. They listened closely to the land, learning its moods and patterns. Over time, the prairie ceased to be strange and became familiar, a place of challenge, yes, but also a place of belonging. Children grew up with these encounters as part of their daily world. They chased prairie dogs, learned the songs of birds, and played in fields of flowers. They accepted coyotes at night as naturally as the wind itself. What frightened their parents became normal to them, shaping a generation that felt at home in a land once considered wild and alien. For the homesteaders, encounters with nature and wildlife were not occasional, they were constant. Each day brought reminders that the prairie was alive, that it moved and breathed with its own rhythm. To survive, they did not conquer it. They learned to endure it, to respect it, and in time to find comfort in its presence. And so, the prairie, with all its creatures and storms, became not only the backdrop of their lives but the very heart of it. It was both adversary and companion, testing their strength while offering moments of wonder. To live there was to live in balance with nature's power, a balance that demanded humility, patience, and unshakable resolve. The story of the homesteaders is not only about survival in the moment, it is also about the legacy they left behind. When families first stepped onto the prairie, the land stretched wide and wild, an open expanse of grass that had endured for centuries. By the time their children and grandchildren walked the same soil, it had been transformed. Fields replaced endless grass, houses dotted the horizon, and communities rose where once there had been silence. The legacy of the homesteaders was written not in books or monuments, but in the very soil they turned and the lives they built. One of their greatest legacies was the transformation of the land itself. What had once been seen as untamed wilderness became farmland. The deep-rooted grasses that had resisted plows for generations gave way to rows of wheat, corn, and barley. Where sod houses once crouched low against the wind, sturdier homes of wood and stone eventually stood. Fences stretched across fields, roads cut through the prairie, and small towns began to appear. In this way, the homesteaders reshaped the landscape, leaving behind a patchwork of human effort upon the endless plains. Their legacy was also one of endurance. To future generations, the homesteaders became symbols of resilience. They endured droughts, storms, and isolation, yet they remained. Their very survival stood as proof of human determination in the face of hardship. Children who grew up in sod houses carried with them the lessons of sacrifice and patience, teaching their own children that life, though hard, could be endured with steady effort. The stories of those early days, of plowing through sod, of winters survived, of fields planted by hand, were told and retold, becoming a kind of family history that instilled pride in generations to come. The homesteader's way of life also helped define the broader spirit of America. The idea of the self-sufficient farmer, working his own land with his own hands, became a central image of independence. Politicians and writers pointed to the homesteaders as examples of what it meant to be free, to own one's land, to rely on one's labor, and to live by one's effort. This vision, though often idealized, took root in the national imagination and shaped how Americans saw themselves for decades to come. Yet the legacy was not without complexity. The land that homesteaders claimed was not empty. It had long been home to native peoples who lived, hunted, and moved across the prairies. The arrival of settlers disrupted these lives, displacing tribes and altering ancient ways of living. For the homesteaders, the prairie was a gift of opportunity. For others, it was a loss of home and tradition. This part of the legacy cannot be overlooked, for it too shaped the story of the prairie. Still, within the homes of settlers, the legacy felt deeply personal. A farm, once nothing but sod and sweat, might remain in the same family for generations. Fields planted by one set of hands were harvested by children, and later by grandchildren. A simple sod house, long gone, might be remembered in family stories as the place where everything began. These memories gave meaning to the hardships endured, proving that their labor was not wasted but carried forward into the future. Education, too, became part of their legacy. The one-room schoolhouses that dotted the prairie were more than places of learning. They were symbols of hope. Parents who had known hardship wanted their children to read, to write, to count, to have chances beyond their own. Many sacrificed to keep schools alive, and their efforts built a foundation of education that would serve rural communities for decades. In this way, the homesteaders left not only farms but also the gift of knowledge to the generations that followed. The legacy was also cultural. Songs sung by firesides, quilts stitched in lonely evenings, hymns raised in small churches. These traditions carried forward. They created a culture of simplicity, of valuing what one had, and of treasuring community. Even today, stories of barn dances, harvest gatherings, and shared meals echo the spirit of those early days. They remind us that the homesteaders' lives, though hard, were not without joy. Perhaps the greatest legacy was the quiet lesson that endurance, though often unnoticed, can shape the world. The homesteaders were not conquerors or kings. Their names are not carved in marble or remembered in great histories. Yet their steady work, turning soil, building homes, raising families, changed the face of a continent. They left behind a living memory, written in the fields that still stretch across the American Midwest, in the towns that grew where their wagons once stopped, and in the descendants who carry their blood and their stories. Even today, when one drives across the plains, the traces of their legacy can be seen. Old barns, weathered by time, still stand. Lines of fences stretch toward the horizon. Roads follow paths first worn by wagon wheels. Beneath modern farms and machines lies the memory of men and women who bent to the same soil with far simpler tools. Their presence lingers in the very shape of the land, in the way it was carved into homesteads and communities. Their legacy is also emotional. They remind us of patience, of humility, of endurance. They teach that life need not be grand to be meaningful, that quiet effort, day by day, can build something lasting. The homesteaders, with their sod houses and weary hands, showed that survival itself is a triumph, and that from such survival can come not only stability but growth. In the calm history of the prairie, the homesteaders stand as figures of endurance, their legacy carried not by monuments but by the land they transformed and the families they raised. Their lives remind us that history is not only made by the loud and the powerful. It is also written, slowly and steadily, by those who endure. And so their legacy continues, quiet, enduring and present, as much a part of the prairie as the wind, the grass, and the endless sky. The journey of the homesteaders across the American prairie draws to a quiet close, not with a sudden ending, but with a slow and steady fading, much like the prairie sunsets they once watched after long days of work. Their story is not one of glory written in bold letters, but of endurance carved gently into the soil, of patience measured in seasons, and of lives lived in harmony with a land both harsh and beautiful. As we look back, we see families arriving with wagons creaking, children clutching small keepsakes, and parents gazing into the horizon with cautious hope. We remember the sod houses, built block by block from the very earth beneath their feet, humble but strong against the relentless winds. We recall their daily routines, marked by the rising of the sun and the setting of the same, filled with endless labor but also the quiet dignity of accomplishment. The prairie tested them, but it also shaped them. The conclusion of their tale lies not in grand victories, but in survival itself. To endure the burning summers, the bitter winters, the floods, the fires, and the loneliness was to triumph. To plant seeds in uncertain soil, to harvest what the land would allow, and to raise children in the face of constant challenge was to succeed. Theirs was a life where each day completed, each season endured, was a quiet victory worthy of remembrance. We also see the balance of hardship and beauty that define their existence. The same land that starved them with droughts offered them skies ablaze with color at dusk. The same winds that howled in winter carried the songs of meadowlarks in spring. Even in moments of trial, the prairie gave back in small gifts: wildflowers blooming in summer, the brilliance of stars scattered across the night sky, the laughter of children carried on the breeze. These moments, though simple, sustained the spirit and gave meaning to the struggle. Their legacy stretches far beyond their lifetimes. Today's vast fields of wheat and corn are built upon their labor, their sweat, and their determination. Small towns across the Midwest began as clusters of sod houses and wooden barns, raised by neighbors who shared one another's burdens. Families who farm the land today walk the same soil once broken by their ancestors' plows. The homesteaders left behind more than fields; they left behind a way of life, a rhythm of endurance, and a testament to human resilience. But the legacy is not only written in the land, it is also written in the spirit. The homesteaders taught us that progress is not always fast, nor is it always grand. Sometimes progress is simply refusing to give up, rising each day to face the challenges before you, and finding dignity in small accomplishments. They remind us that perseverance, though quiet, has the power to shape the future in ways more lasting than we often imagine. The story also carries humility. These men, women, and children were not seeking glory or fame. Their names are rarely remembered in history books, and few monuments mark their graves. Yet, through their endurance, they changed the face of a continent. They remind us that history is often made not by the loudest voices, but by the steady persistence of ordinary lives lived with extraordinary resilience. Now, as we imagine the prairie once more, let us picture it in its calmest hour. The tall grasses sway gently in the evening wind, golden in the fading light. The horizon stretches endlessly, blending into the sky painted with the colors of sunset. In the distance, faint echoes linger: the creak of wagon wheels, the crackle of a fire, the murmur of a family gathered close in their humble home. Though their voices are long silent, the memory of their lives remains in the land they shaped. The calm history of the homesteaders is not meant to stir us into restlessness, but to soothe us with its steady rhythm. It invites us to reflect on patience, on humility, on the strength that comes from simply enduring. Their story, though filled with hardship, offers peace, a reminder that even in the harshest of conditions, life can be meaningful and survival itself can be noble. And so, as this story comes to an end, we rest with them beneath the vast prairie sky. We breathe in the silence, we listen to the whispers of the wind through the grass, and we carry with us the lesson they left behind: that perseverance, quiet and unyielding, is its own form of triumph. This is the legacy of the homesteaders. This is their story. And in its calm, steady way, it will never be forgotten.